Good morning again, everybody. If you were here in the previous session, you already know who Gina Perry is. She is someone who pretends to be a former psychologist. She is also, if you weren't here in the previous session, she is also the author of the amazing Behind the Shock Machine, which is a non-fiction expose of therapy, I guess. And it was made into an award-winning Radio National production called Beyond the Shock Machine, which Gina co-produced, which must have been an extraordinary experience. Yeah. Gina's not here to talk about that, though. She is here to talk about My Father the Whale, among other things, which is her most recent... And your debut novel? Yeah. So welcome. Gina is being interrogated this time in a role reversal situation, which as a former psychologist you must be enjoying, by Andrea Rowe. Andrea describes herself as a copywriter by day and an award-winning children's author by night. And it's true, in 2022 she won the Australia Council, oh my God, the Children's Book Council of Australia, Children's Picture Book of the Year, Early Childhood Division. She's also an award-winning author of short stories. Her writing celebrates culture, family, diversity, and the environment. She reads books late at night, which isn't a bad habit, I don't think. And she has just been awarded the May Gibbs Fellowship for 2024, which is huge. And please don't be alarmed, there is a photographer from the Warrnambool Weekly wandering about. It's not creepy, it's publicity. I'll hand over to Andrea.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction of us both, Robert. And well done, everyone, for being the stayers today and coming back to have more author goodness as well. It's fantastic to be here. You'll notice that we have one chair missing today. Originally, Maya Linnell was joining us as well for this conversation. Sadly, Maya can't be with us with family illness at the moment, but Gina and I are going to soldier on and contribute to a wonderful conversation about families in books and more importantly, a most stunning debut novel for Gina, which is My Father the Whale, which as a reader I devoured this book in two fast evenings, because that's when I read my books, and I was definitely held in a place of great tenderness and a compelling read. So My Father the Whale is the story of coming to terms with your childhood effectively and the family you were born into as well as the family you choose. And the book really prizes open the cracks of complex family dynamics and I think really allows us as readers to peer into the brokenness of families that can be sometimes quite devastating and sometimes very tender as well. But before we delve any further into the discussion of the book, Gina, could you share with us who we're about to meet in My Father the Whale as we discuss the book today?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. The book features two main characters, that is Mitch and his daughter Ruby, and when the book begins they are travelling around Australia as they have been since Ruby was a baby, and they busk for a living and they live out of a combi, and the combi really is Ruby's entire world and her father is the centre of that world, and he believes that the life they're living is idyllic, it's unconventional, it's free from the trappings of material pursuits. He feels it's a wonderful way to bring up a child. And Ruby, when the book opens, is very much attached to those same ideas, although she has her own particular preferences for things that would be different to her father's. So at the opening of the book there is a sense that Ruby is a child who yes, predominantly shares her dad's view of the world, but we can see already that things will change.
It really was, you deep dived very quickly into this wonderful situation and this life in the combi van. And I was quite drawn to two quotes that I read by other respected authors in talking about the book. And Vavel Parrott actually said that it's a story of struggle and a vulnerable portrayal of brokenness, love and loyalty. And our own Jock Sarong also said that it paints the relationship between parents and children in all of their complexity, the evasions that are practiced out of love or or self-delusion. And not many readers would have grown up the way Ruby grew up, of course. Could you tell us, did you know that you were engineering such a fragile family story and vulnerable family story in the very beginning?
The story began as a short story, and the two characters appeared to me in a short story, and the tension between them was really crackling, and it was around the fact that there was this very unconventional father and a child who seemed to be much more conventional, naturally more conventional, and they were having an argument about the fact that he had always homeschooled her and she was drawn to the idea of going to school. So I knew that story had something really powerful. There was something very strong in terms of that tension between the characters, and it made me think that I wanted to write a story that was about that moment that as a child, whatever age you are, and in this book it's not until Ruby's in her mid-20s, but that point in your life where you define yourself as different from your parents, and for some people that takes a long time. And because of the way Ruby's raised in this bubble and with her father at the centre of her world, and the fact that they're always moving, they never settle in any one place, and so they're forced, or she's forced, to really rely on her father in a way that most families, there wouldn't be that intensity. But I could see then that any attempt by this child to be different or become independent would be a real challenge to their relationship, because her father wants her really to be a mini version of himself, to share his beliefs and his view of the world.
I'm really interested in, I want to talk about Ruby in depth, but Mitch is a very flawed character, doing his best to kind of hold it all together and stuffing up along the way. I feel like I've met a lot of Mitches in my life. We lived in our camper trailer for quite some time with our children and travelled Australia, and I'm also lived in our little trailable yacht for a while, and we often met quite focused people on the lifestyle they want to live or the beliefs they have. Sometimes they're griftery type people as well. So I felt like Mitch was a very familiar person I encountered. You know, busker by trade, he juggles with this self-delusion and self-preservation. He has some very significant beliefs with how the outside world should or shouldn't intrude on his life that he's trying to create in this combi van with Ruby. But I also had a lot of empathy for him. I thought he was quite a fascinating person. Did you feel that same sense of empathy writing him? Because he was a source of conflict for Ruby quite quickly.
Yeah, I did, because Ruby loves him, and she really... that was my way into feeling more sympathetic and empathic towards Mitch. He is a flawed character, but he's extremely self-absorbed. I mean, his view of the world is that they have this life and that Ruby will bob along in his wake. And so in some ways he's very disrespectful of her independence. But in other ways, he's extremely encouraging of that independence. So he is a complicated character, and he gives her very mixed messages about her place in the world and her relationship with him.
And I think there's two pivotal scenes for me, well probably three, but two that do stand out is there's a kind of a moment, they're effectively dumpster diving, aren't they, at the back of a supermarket or something, which is his sort of self-reliance and determination to, they hardly have two bob, of course. So, and then there's another scene where there's some people that he's met at the pub or something, at a party. He brings them back to the combi van, and he's a father of defending his daughter at that stage, but another time he's pushing her into this very unsavoury and unhealthy situation. So I found that contrast of who he was quite incredible. I thought you wrote that so beautifully.
Well, he's both protective, but he's also extremely careless and puts her in very vulnerable situations. So that's where she gets very mixed messages about her capacity to look after herself.
And I want to talk about Ruby because, she's this 10-year-old girl when we first meet her. I really, really admire your incredible ability to write such a nuanced young voice. She was, she was getting to know who she was and getting to know who she could be in the world. And she felt very, very relatable. Also, too, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I was seeing I was watching that child's sort of development through the character of Ruby. I felt it was really deeply felt characterisation of Ruby for me, and I was wondering how you wrote her onto the page, what you were tapping into to write this young girl, and then of course, as we get to know her through the novel, she progresses in age, and later on we're meeting her in her 30s later on. So, how do you sort of maintain her voice from an early age of childhood right through to womanhood?
Well, the voice of the child, Ruby, I really felt that when those characters that I first wrote in a short story, I said earlier that they really gripped me. I really felt like there was a voice immediately for me that was Ruby's particular point of view. And I don't want to make it sound easy, but I felt like I followed where that voice led. So particularly in the childhood section where what I'm writing is from her point of view so that the adult reader is aware of things that Ruby is not. So that I'm hoping that there's a tension there for the reader in perceiving that she's in unsafe situations at times, but she's not aware of that because of the things that Mitch has told her or because this is the norm where Mitch and Ruby are concerned. So carrying the voiceover into adulthood was a challenge, imaginatively, to make a leap as I do from someone who's 10 to someone who's in their early 20s. You don't want to make it just the child in an adult body, but you have to make the person consistent and recognisable. So I felt like in writing the adult Ruby, I actually had to do a lot more rewriting. I did a lot of writing about that adult Ruby that never made it into the book because I had to get to know her as an older person.
So in effect, you're telling yourself the story. You're telling yourself the voice. You're writing your way through to finding her adult voice.
Yes.
Fantastic. It's really interesting to know. The naive Ruby's voice was, really remarkable. And you read other authors like Mark Brandy, who writes the naive voice so well too. I sort of really just enjoyed how we were observing the world through her eyes as well. And of course, with all of this that goes on in Ruby's life and this combi van existence and town to town and this busking life that they're trying to hold on to as this young girl is growing, salvation really falls in her lap or comes her way in the form of this family, the Stanleys, who become her sort of idea of what a family could be or should be or can be for Ruby. And they're almost kind of like the family of a different era in some ways. And they become this ideal for her to step away from this unstructured nomadic life into something safe as well. I felt, though, that they were such a great ruse to sort of put in this kind of prise open the cracks of conflict in the story. So Ruby was already picking away. Was that your hope, that they were our source of conflict to make that big transition happen in the story?
I felt that the combi breaks down and they don't have any money to fix the combi. So Mitch, they're stuck in a small coastal town, and Mitch has to get a job, which he hates the idea of doing. And Ruby is forced to go to school, which they've avoided until now. So I had the sense there that once Ruby was in one place for an extended period of time, I mean, she's always curious about other people when they stay in caravan parks, which Mitch never likes doing, but they occasionally have to. She likes it because she actually likes walking around and seeing how other people live and getting insights. So that curiosity about people is there from the beginning. But when the combi breaks down and they're stuck in this town of Whalers Bay, she meets someone at school, Fiona, and she begins to, and I don't know about anyone else, but I remember the moment in my childhood when I first made the comparison between the life of my family and the life of another family, and there was just that absolute moment where I thought, oh, my family isn't the same as everybody else's. Everybody's family is different.
And I think that's what makes Ruby so relatable as well, because teenagers really do go through this stage. You know, they're sort of side-eyeing other families and people and sort of, you know, weighing up who they are. And then, you know, there is that comparison of, you know, what they have, what their rules are like, what their lifestyle is like as well. So that very much made her a relatable character. But of course, she was so ripe for change as well, and ready for change. She needed that moment. Were the Stanleys a kind of an ideal, almost old-fashioned family of a different era as well? It felt like
so.
They were kind of a very different family dynamic.
Yes. Well, they're in a town that is still kind of stuck in the past. I mean, it's a fictional town, but it's not far from Byron Bay, which has already started evolving, and so it's a farming community. And yes, I wanted them to be wanted it to be a conservative place, so that Mitch felt out of place, and also that Ruby notices things about the Stanleys, at this family, that cause her to make comparisons. And I think it's the first time she really begins to understand the difference between not just how she and her father have lived, but the difference in values. And yes, the Stanleys are quite conservative, but they're also an intact family. There's a mother, which is the thing that is so striking, I think, on an unconscious level anyway for Ruby, because her mother is an out-of-bounds topic with Mitch. All she knows is her mother died when she was born, and there's a couple of photographs that Mitch has secreted away that he thinks Ruby doesn't have any idea about, but she does. So there is that mystery for her in her life, that fantasising about a mother that she's never known. So when she meets this family and they welcome her, she soaks it up.
And I want to touch on, because we haven't talked about her mother that much, there is this sort of other narrative running through about the story of the missing mother and the secrets and silences that really circle Ruby's heart. And I want to talk about this truth-telling in families and the secrets we keep, as well as, you know, the myths that we hold on to throughout generations of families as well. And, you know, generations of families navigate this every day with, you know, what was the actual truth behind this? Who did know the story? You know, we unpack this a little bit later, and I don't want to be too much of a spoiler here of what's happening, but was it challenging you to reflect on if it's better to lie or if it's better to have the truth out there entirely, because there seems to be this space in which Ruby's constantly pushing her dad for the truth, and she's searching for the little clues, like finding the photos of her mother. And even later, the Stanleys are kind of pushing her along to kind of make a connection with wider family as well. Was that a challenging area for you to navigate with the novel?
Well, I felt like the big tension between Ruby and Mitch is that even though they're very close, literally, they live in this bubble, there is this thing that is unspoken. I mean, he basically refuses to speak about her mother, and she reads him very well, and she looks for moments when he is more likely to be forthcoming and tries to find out information about her mother. I felt like that was a good tension because there is something problematic about his silence. And we get a sense perhaps of his vulnerability, that perhaps, I think that as writing it, it makes you, or reading about it too, I think it makes you wonder whether or not this is a source of grief for him that is causing the silence, or is it something else? But either way, it felt like a cruelty to me. It felt that he was withholding.
He was keeping something from her, wasn't he? He was,
yeah.
he was withholding.
Yeah, and there's one thing to keep a secret, but to be absolutely silent on a topic, apart from the bare facts about a mother's death, seemed a cruel thing to do to a child.
It was interesting because you felt grief for Ruby in reading the book, because you felt like there was a part of her that didn't have the information or the complete history of herself that she needed. And that was the points where I thought, I really don't like you, Mitch.
Yeah.
So that was a fantastic terrain to navigate between empathy to dislike. There's numerous references and scenes in the book that point to the intergenerational impacts on how we grow up, and the decisions that are sometimes made around us as young children for who we do and don't communicate with in a family, and what events we do and don't go with, or, a family that's cut off completely for us. And we learn later on in the book that Mitch's own childhood has kind of shaped his behaviour as well. I was reading this book around Father's Day. I was finishing it around Father's Day, and at a time when, so many fathers and daughters are reflecting or reconnecting as well. And it really gave me pause to think about Mitch and to also wonder for Ruby about the inherited impacts on her and what skills he might pass on to her to help her survive and navigate life as well. Because he did pass skills on to her that were valuable to her as a young woman as well, didn't he?
He did, yeah. I mean, she's certainly grown up with an incredible degree of independence and resilience, despite the fact that really he lives a very hedonistic life, and Ruby has to fit in around his needs. But in doing that, she does learn to entertain herself. She learns to look after herself. She learns to kind of find ways to manage her own loneliness that are a weight for a child that age. Yes, so his imperfections and his self-centeredness actually don't necessarily help her, but she certainly responds to them in creative ways. And she develops, I think, capacities that she might not have done otherwise.
You could really see the impact then as she's a young woman, so she's very self-reliant. She sort of is drifting a little bit as a young woman as well, of course, so that is another impact on her. She hasn't, although she's settled in place, she's remained in this town, she hasn't quite settled in who she is in this person in the world, although she eventually sort of touches on and starts to find things. But even during sort of romantic relationships, it's like she's just giving herself a cameo role almost in those relationships as well, which I thought was really fascinating too. That was just an aside because it really made me think about the impacts of how we grow up and how that informs who we become as an adult. I was really interested to know too, with the aspect of family myths and the dark seams of secrets. Do you think secret keeping sometimes in a family is about survival and preservation of a family?
I think in the case of Ruby and Mitch, that the secret keeping, I think he keeps a secret out of fear, because I think in disclosing and being truthful to Ruby, I think he has to admit things that he thinks would mean that she didn't love him anymore or she would reject him. And so in that sense, I can see that it's functional, but I think there's also a place for him to come clean. And even though the Stanleys, for example, ask her openly about her mother, and even there's a conversation between Pauline Stanley and Mitch where she asks him directly about Ruby's mother and he shuts her down. That contrast between what is a normal curiosity and interest from people, I think really highlights for Ruby the unfairness of that secret keeping.
Yes, definitely. And actually, I'm really glad you talked about Pauline because she was such a strong character in the books, very stoic countrywoman, the matriarch of the family, Pauline Stanley, they're the family that take Ruby in. And she almost becomes this sort of whisper in Ruby's ear as Ruby's growing, as well as, you know, who you can be, where you can go. She and Ruby clearly, and sorry, we may not have explained that there's a timeline later on in the book where we're meeting Ruby in later life as well, and you know that she's really been another voice in Ruby's ear, sort of telling her that she believes in her but giving her permission to do things as well. It struck me in the book that there were some really strong female characters, and that also in meeting them, often females do the heavy lifting in families of, you know, kind of trying to smooth over the cracks or make the connections happen or bring the people together, maybe just as my family. But, you know, there is a lot of work done by females to sort of keep people together or sort of smooth out those waters. And we see Pauline step in as a surrogate mother, and then later on we meet an aunt of Ruby's, Nadia, who helps her piece together some information. And then we have this almost half-sister, so the Stanley's daughter, Fiona, who is kind of a sister friend, really. I really loved that you brought these three very different women in to help Ruby piece together parts of herself. Did you feel that those female characters were absolutely pivotal in helping Ruby navigate her own journey as well?
Yes, and I think she's drawn to women profoundly in the story. And with Pauline Stanley, Fiona's mother, she never directly tells Ruby to question the things that Mitch has told her, but she tells her a story about how she met Fiona's father, and she talks about how she approached this boy that she'd met and was really attracted to, and she wrote him a letter after she met him because she realised that unless she contacted him after this time when she met him at a dance, that she wouldn't see him again, or she'd see him again and he'd be with someone else, he'd be married. So she secretly writes him a letter and never tells her parents about it. And she tells Ruby this story and she says how horrified her parents would have been to think that their daughter had written to this man and you know, made an assignation. And she's really saying to Ruby, I did that because you can't be constrained by pleasing your parents. You have to step out and do things sometimes that might seem shocking or out of character, but it's important to do it for yourself. So she's telling her indirectly through that story that she should perhaps step out and ask questions or do things that Mitch wouldn't approve of in order to further her own development, I guess, as a person. So I felt that was really important to have that in the story. And Fiona is Pauline's daughter. She is also an only child, and I felt that that was important too, so that Ruby has a comparison of an only child in a family with the mother and father. And Fiona really is itching to get away. It's not that she doesn't love her parents, but she's just dying to get to the city, and she's...
Small town girl, wants to get out of here.
Absolutely.
Which is such a contrast to Ruby, because
Yes.
Ruby wanted to get in there.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
it was amazing, that
So
contrast.
Ruby's drawn to that household, and you can imagine her being a homebody there, whereas Fiona is already making plans for how she's going to move to the city and do big things. So, yeah, the women are important in the story because Ruby's childhood has been dominated by her father, and really it's the women in her life, I think, that help her come to terms with her relationship with her dad and how they're going to be together from in her adulthood. Because it's not something she's ever been able to resolve.
And I think too, they're giving her just permission to have those conversations and explore that a little bit further. I loved the aunt that we met later, Nadia, who you don't like her in the beginning, but she quite quickly helps Ruby piece some information together, and she's almost begrudgingly generous with what she's helping Ruby understand about her past. And she was another classic character where you don't really want to like her, but then quite quickly you shift your opinion as well. So I think you do that very well. You have us sort of skating over, who are you? Do I like you? Where am I sitting with you?
Well, I think that was Ruby's response too. I think she thought that being reunited with a family member would be something wonderful. But in fact, her aunt is quite abrasive and suspicious, and in some ways quite ungenerous. And Ruby realises that that looking for information about her mother, it's always going to be filtered through other people and through their own experiences.
And Nadia brings this other level to the story where we already know there's grief in the story. Ruby is grieving a mother she hasn't had the chance to have a connection with and to grow with. And when we get to meet Nadia later on in the story, Nadia is bringing another several layers of grief from the family. There are many other elements of the story. What did you learn or reflect on about grief in families when you were sort of writing this section of the book as well?
Well, I think that grief is the heart of the story. There's Mitch's grief, even though it comes out in strange ways. There's Ruby's grief at not knowing a mother, and there's the grief that she discovers in her mother's family because they've experienced so much loss and so much disruption, and that the death of her mother was something that really destroyed her grandparents' life in some way. It was something they never recovered from. So being reunited with that family is really being brought back to a place of people being fractured by the death of someone that has had big ramifications for that family. So it is a death that has resonated for not just Ruby's grandparents and aunts, but also for Mitch and for herself. So it goes across the generations.
These threads.
It just manifests itself in very different ways.
Yeah, it was really incredible. I don't want to talk about it too much because I don't want to give everything away because you need to buy the book. But there were fantastic layers sort of that you explored each time. One thing as well, just to change the course of the questioning a little bit, is that I felt this book was very uniquely Australian, and I'm a big fan of reading our culture in all books and our country on pages. You know, we've got combi vans, we've got hippie dads and harem pants, we've got ag shows, small coastal towns, caravan parks where there's the residents and then the blow-ins as well, grey nomads. We've got the declining industry in some towns, and then the rise in tourism as well. I know that this was set in a sort of a kind of outskirts of Byron Bay or the outlying districts, but it could have been a kind of a Port Fairy, Western District type story as well. We've got the development of the whale watching tourism as well, so there was certainly some familiarities too. And I know even the combi van had a sense of place. You really felt like you were being carried along with this story. How important is your sense of place when you're writing, an entire novel? And this was your debut fiction novel as well.
Well, I felt that the place was crucial in this story because they are always moving. And so Ruby is noticing things in a way that she wouldn't if they were living in one place. The Whalers Bay, which is the fictional town where they are stranded initially and then where Ruby stays, I felt that it was really important to anchor Ruby in specific settings and also to allow us to see how she reacts to new people and new situations. So I think the place is really important in the story, both symbolically but also on a very functional level too, because Whalers Bay is really the first place that Ruby is able to put down any roots at all. And so when we meet her as an adult, she's still there. She's drifting, but she's drifting in terms of her identity. But you have the sense that she's put down her roots in this place.
Well, she's also become a part of the history of the town. She moves into the town as a bushfire has come through some of the outlying areas as well. So she's there as part of its history. And then when we meet her later on in the life, she's stepping into, she's a kind of playing around with being an artist and sort of denying herself to say she's an artist, but she's also working with this whaling. Where did that come from? Working with this whale watching business, and she's sort of pioneering the steps as well, which I really like because it is giving her permission to, you belong here, isn't it? Yeah, which is lovely. Did you enjoy writing? Because there are some hilarious scenes, like, they're in the camping in the they're going to agricultural shows and they're doing their sort of busking acts, and then they're staying in these caravan parks. Did you enjoy researching and sort of imagining that world as well?
I did. I loved it, actually, and I learned a lot about agricultural shows just for that one scene, because I didn't know a lot about them. I mean, I've obviously been to them, but that's not the same as wanting to write about them. So I felt
there was a strong visual connection when you wrote about those.
Yes, I felt like I needed to have that the world had to be absolutely believable, and I felt very strongly that Ruby's character was very believable, Mitch's character was very believable, but the world that they inhabited had to be just as believable, even though it was changing. So the agricultural show scene, I would have done a lot of research for that. Similarly, writing a fictional town that was actually had a whaling station there, and that now when they arrive has a tuna factory. So it's still doing some, that sort of fish processing. And then when we meet Ruby as a young adult, the fish processing is gone and the whale watching tours have taken that place. So I did enjoy that, but it felt very important to me that the places felt real. So I'm very pleased that you felt that they were real.
And you neglected to mention the warm white wines outside caravan parks at that
Yes.
kind of, sunset hour that can go terribly wrong then too.
Yes.
No, it was very believable. There's also some awe-filled scenes in the book where Ruby encounters creatures that she loves, and she has this love of horses and whales that persist from childhood into her adult life as well. So she comes to she comes to be able to ride a tamed Brumby, Melba, is that right? And Melba becomes her kind of riding companion as well. And then she also has some pivotal moments where she is first exposed to sort of whales coming out of the water, and just that awesome moment of seeing these incredible creatures. Why does Ruby gravitate to these animals, and what do they offer for her?
Well, in the case of the Brumbies, the book opens with a scene where they're in Western Queensland and they pull over to watch a group of Brumbies that are racing through the bush. I think for Ruby, it's something about, obviously it's something she shares with Mitch. He has a love of animals, particularly animals in the wild. And so when she arrives in Whalers Bay and meets this family who have the Brumby, she's conflicted because Mitch has always been so insistent that animals should stay wild and should remain in the wild, whereas Mr. Stanley says, well, that's a romanticised view because life is extremely tough for Brumbies, and this particular Brumby would have died if it hadn't have been rescued. So I felt like after I wrote that, I didn't write it deliberately, but I did feel afterwards when I looked at that was a metaphor too for the freedom that Mitch romanticises and supposedly offers, but that it comes with consequences. And I felt like that worked. But for Ruby, there's something about the love of animals that is portable. If you don't have people in your life, if you don't have anyone other than your father, there are always animals, caravan parks and things. There's always...
that draw you to them.
That's
yes.
right.
Yeah.
The whales, she's fascinated by whales as a child, and because Mitch does kind of very slapdash homeschooling, she knows a lot about some things and not much about others, but she does know a lot about whales, and she's troubled even as a child that the mother whale after the calf is born, the mother whale and the calf will stay closely together. I think it's for 2 years, and that the calf can even drink milk and swim at the same. Well, obviously they can drink milk and swim at the same time, but they have this incredible close bond, and the father whale is gone. After insemination, it's the mother that calves, and then when the calf is a particular age and independent enough, the mother, when the calf is sleeping, just slips away and leaves it on its own. And Ruby is troubled by this because she feels that it's so cruel, and Mitch just says, well, that's the animal kingdom for you. So there's also these lessons, I suppose, for Ruby about life when it comes to animals, which is the other reason I think she's so drawn to them. And the irony, of course, is that Whalers Bay, the whales don't come in close enough for her to really see them very often because it has had that history as a whaling station.
It's incredible how she's constantly drawn to them, because she then she's obviously a great artist as well, and while she's been encouraged in her school time, she sort of doesn't quite make that sort of full step to, going to maybe following Fiona to the city and going for those opportunities. But yet she's still in love with the whale and painting the whale in where she is. So she has a lot of, I felt like she really was so connected, definitely, with the calling of the whale. And I felt it felt like a home base for her too. It was really interesting to read that.
Well, she's stuck emotionally too because she's not been able to resolve things with her father. So in some ways it's not possible for her to move on.
Now, something happens later in the book without giving too much away, but Mitch returns in her adult years and he's partnered, and she meets, so we meet a very different Mitch, I feel, slightly reformed Mitch in some ways, and more maybe self-aware, or maybe it's that Ruby's in a different space as well. And the book very clearly shifts your thoughts about who Mitch was in her childhood. For me, I kind of felt like I could forgive Mitch a lot more, and I'm not sure if that's just the space you're in sometimes as a reader as well. Was that your hope, that there could be that opportunity for Mitch to redeem himself with Ruby?
I think in some ways he's still the same person, but he's had some of his edges knocked off.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, physically he's quite different. He's no longer the hippie with the long plait and the hair and pants, and he's done quite well for himself. But by capitalising on the knowledge and skills of other people, he's done well for himself. So.
Which again is a bit not that generous towards Ruby,
yes.
because she hasn't benefited from that in those stages.
Yes. So, she's totally, she's still as frugal really as an adult as she was as a child. Whereas when she meets him again, he's actually doing very well financially. And in some ways he's just as self-absorbed, but he has softened somewhat.
Yes, I felt he had myself.
I didn't think it was
definitely.
Believable that he would come back as a different person.
No, that's true. Although I felt what does happen, of course, is we see him in a different light as he's connected with another child, and it's how she sees, him stepping into that space of how he could be a father in a different time as well. I felt that was very interesting. You've got a master's degree in creative nonfiction and a PhD as well, and a background in journalism and writing nonfiction books. And you were shortlisted for the HarperCollins Banjo Prize in 2021 as well. I'm really interested to know, leaping from your background in creative nonfiction, how does that help you, all of those skills and that experience, help you finesse a novel like this that's so tender and vulnerable and sort of really takes us on a journey? How does that help you refine your writing?
I think great nonfiction and great fiction are both about great storytelling. So certainly in non-fiction, I think the non-fiction that I love to read has strong characterisation, a great sense of setting and a kind of arc that engages me and keeps me reading. So I feel like I learnt a lot in my academic studies, and I also wrote the 2 books that I published were the results of my master's and PhD research. So I felt like that gave me a lot in terms of the novel, but the things I didn't know, and I'd written quite a few short stories, and I'd written the draft of this novel before I started a master's. So I felt like I still had to learn things like what makes a chapter. I'd never really thought about that before. I'd never learnt how to do that sort of structural work in writing a novel.
And what about things like, dialogue or writing place or things like that? Is there anything else there that you had to really sort of dig deep to learn or reflect on?
I think my fiction writing actually informed my non-fiction rather than the other way around. But I do think having published 2 books of non-fiction gave me the confidence to think, okay, I can go back to that draft of a novel and I can finish it and it might turn into a book. I mean, that's the next big thing. It's one thing to finish a manuscript and feel happy with it. It's quite another to get it published. So I really did feel that those books and those projects gave me the confidence to go back and tackle fiction, which I'd kind of given up on, really. I think I felt like non-fiction was easier for me. That's what I felt at that point.
So what keeps you going when you've almost given up on yourself? What keeps you coming back to not just writing, but then persisting with pitching and being open, or considering things like the Banjo Prize and submitting to that? What keeps you moving forward there?
I decided to get someone to help me. So I used the lockdown during COVID and I got a mentor, basically, someone I'd never met, didn't know me, which was terrific. And we worked together where we set deadlines, we met regularly, we reviewed the manuscript, and the end goal for me was that I would have something ready in time for submission to the Banjo Prize. I didn't expect to be shortlisted, but I was using it as a deadline for myself. And I also did some of those speed pitching sessions with the ASA, I think it was, yeah. And I had really good responses from the 3 publishers that I met through that program. So that made me feel like I was onto a good thing.
Definitely onto a good thing. It's such a beautiful book. And I think we've just got a few moments. We're going to ask you to, we haven't done this many times this weekend, to read a short extract, which I believe you've chosen. Is it the opening scene of the book? Is that correct?
It's close to the opening. It's where they're practising in the caravan park.
Terrific.
Yeah.
I think it's a great way to set the scene as well. Thank you, Gina.
I'm just going to find the spot now. I didn't bookmark it, sorry. Okay, here we go, yep. So this scene is very much at the beginning of the book and they're staying in a caravan park and Mitch is insisting that Ruby practice before they appear the next day at the talent quest at the local agricultural show. Mitch stepped out of his tent. He'd swapped his hair and pants for a pair of shorts and braided his hair into a long plait. He sat down on the grass and wriggled the unicycle seat to test the bolts. She frowned. Do we have to practice? She flopped her legs flat on the ground. It's so hot. A sprinkler sprayed the banana palms beside the shower block, making a smacking sound as the water hit the leaves. The air seemed thick and shimmered in time with the clack-clack of the sprinkler. Pah, this is nothing. It'll be just as hot tomorrow. He squeezed the tyre. Best time to practice is when this place is empty. She didn't need to practice. I can do it in my sleep, she grumbled to herself. Mitch picked up the unicycle and walked away. She followed him slowly. By the time she got to the shaded side of the laundry, he'd run the lead through the open window for the cassette player and he was doing squats, standing and bending, the unicycle behind him on the grass. She leaned against the wall, trying not to breathe in the smell of hot soap, lifting one leg up and then behind her in a slow stretch. A washing machine thumped inside the laundry and Mitch fiddled with the volume so they could hear the music over the noise of the machine. He was always mixing up the music, so she never knew what was coming. She felt a fizz of energy as soon as the kettle drums started. She loved this song. Boy George started singing, I'll Tumble For You. Mitch was on the unicycle, swirling and making figure eights on the grass. She sprang forward, cartwheeling and landing on each U, then off again, weaving in and out of the curling, unfolding shapes he made on the unicycle. Then he was off it, squatting sumo style, and she leapt onto his back and onto his shoulders. He was on the unicycle again, then she was standing, straightening up, arms out wide, eyes ahead as he moved in circles beneath her. This was the best part, the swimming, dizzy feeling as the world spun and the view unfolded with each turn. She could see across the top of the hill's hoist, over the flat roof of the TV room, past the square of the pool, to the caravan park's entrance with its curved brickwork, and beyond to the road. The music stopped and the world turned slowly in the sudden quiet. Too slowly. Perhaps it was the grass slowing them down. She looked down past the top of his head. She saw his chest wet with sweat, his knees not flashing but pumping slowly with effort. She felt a trembling through his shoulders, moving into her feet and up into her body. She saw something she hadn't noticed before, how much effort it took for him to carry her on his shoulders, and how the practicing he insisted on was for him, not her. The world seemed to wobble, shift. His hands were on her feet for a moment, as if to steady her. Then she felt them lift and fly outwards. They were in sync again. She gulped a mouthful of warm air and forced herself to look up and stare straight ahead. From up here, she could see how deserted the place was, as if she and Mitch were the only people left in the world.
See what I mean? Such a masterful writer of place and people. I think we have a time for a couple of questions before we wrap up for the day. If anyone does have any questions to ask Gina. Yes.
About how much parents invest in their children, and they expect them to follow their own beliefs and lifestyles. But ironically, I think when Ruby goes out on her own, that's a success for Mitch, that she's become independent. Even though that's probably the grief that you're talking about.
What was the last bit? Sorry.
When Ruby goes on her own way with her own beliefs, that's a success for Mitch, that she's become her own woman.
That's true. That's actually true. I guess the cost to that, though, is a lot of pain and heartache, and it takes a long time. We were talking earlier about whether or not when people talk about a coming-of-age novel, I always think that that's coming of age is sort of around the teen years, but for Ruby it takes a lot longer, because in order to move on with her life, she really does have to forge a new relationship with her dad. So, yeah, she does get her independence from that experience, yeah.
Rob.
Thank you very much. I was just curious, how did you come up with the title?
I mentioned before that I had a mentor. The person who recommended that mentor to me was a writer in WA called Laurie Steed. And Laurie read the manuscript, and he sent me an article that he'd found. It was like a tongue-in-cheek article that kind of anthropomorphised whales. And it'd been written for Father's Day. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, and it was talking about how how whales made poor fathers but great boyfriends, because they're there for the insemination and then they go. And he just said to me, "I think My Father the Whale would be a great title." And I thought, what? And then when I read the article, I thought actually it did really feel like it worked. So thank you, Laurie Steed.
Great question. Yeah. And I think we had a question from someone over here. And further up the back.
I wonder if Mitch ever encountered the long-arm child protection authorities in his journey.
Well, yes. What they do is he's already schooled Ruby from a young age to pretend if anyone asks, if any authority ever approaches them, and there is a couple of points in the story where they do interact with the authorities, that they are on holiday from Melbourne and that their primary residence is Melbourne, and that Ruby's just had permission to have a couple of weeks off school. So that is the cover story. But one of the reasons that she goes to school in Whalers Bay is because the authorities do visit. Someone obviously has let I mean, it's implied in the story that someone in the town has notified the authorities that this child is not in school, but also perhaps being neglected, being left alone for periods of time. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for your questions. It's been a wonderful conversation. My Father the Whale really is a testament to your persistence in mastering the craft of writing a novel and transitioning your writing across as well. It's sublime and subtle, and it's a really compelling read. And thank you, Gina, so much for sharing with us today. We've really appreciated it. Please thank Gina.
Thank you. Thank you.